parents, my father, my mother both flew. My brother was in the Royal Naval Flying Corps. My sister was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And so right throughout all my life, I've had this feeling of belonging in aerospace. I have a picture of my home, which was taken in 1932 when I was 4 years old and was flying with my father, and he gave me this camera and he said, take a picture, and we were in an open airplane, and he came over upside down, much to my mother's frantic annoyance, and she is actually in the picture, but you can't see it properly, shaking her fist at my father. Well, we've got to realize that a lot of this had already been done. And the fact is, of course, we didn't know, or the West didn't know, that the Chinese had already, at least 100 or 200 years before, sailed with 300 ships and 30,000 men halfway around the world. And they decided, in an extraordinary turnaround, the Chinese, having got right around the Horn and literally coming up to discover Europe, decided it wasn't worth discovering, so they turned around. The boats were called back, they called them back, and they burned them. They were using ships that held 3,000 people. And this was in the 1300s we're talking about. And so they had very advanced technology. They destroyed their technology. Something that we better learn a lot about in the United States, because we may do the same thing with our space program.
In 1972, the Club of Rome published their Limits to Growth report. Why did Western civilization produce this? And what was your reaction to their theory?
We had reached a situation in which our own scientific knowledge was showing us that our technological advances were having an impact upon the Earth. That, in fact, in those days, the US was using about 80% of the world's resources for 6% of the population, and that it was quite evident that with the explosion in population and the increase in medical services throughout the world and keeping people alive in the third world, that we couldn't go on doing this, and there was no way whatever that the rest of the world could ever live like we do in the United States. And this became a very, very large issue in the 60s and 70s, when in the 60s in particular, when we really believed that we understood how to spark development, and that in fact this was a scientific endeavor that we could go to the third world nations and say, hey, you just do this and you just fiddle around with that and you just follow our example and you're away to the races. And of course it took us 10 years to find out that we were completely mistaken and we didn't understand the situation at all. But at the same time, it was quite evident that the amount of resources that we were using could not be repeated all around the world. This actually came at the same time, or very shortly after, Rachel Carson's had written a seminal work, a book, which really had tremendous impact in the early 60s, and that was The Silent Spring. And if you could ever put down the rise of the modern environmental movement to any particular time, it was that date, probably in 1963. And this led to the whole beginnings of the United Nations Conference in 1972, in Stockholm, Sweden, the first conference on the environment, where Barbara Ward and Margaret Mead were so much in evidence and were such great leaders of thought and of the whole movement. Now, all of this was coming at the same time, and the Club of Rome, a group of 100 industrialists from all around the world, all around the developing nations and even the underdeveloped nations, and led by an Italian called Aurelio Pecci, who started it, and that was why it was called the Club of Rome, decided that this required a major study, that we had to find out what really were the limits to growth. Unfortunately, what they really found out, and having been somewhat involved in that study, both from the funding it and from the point of view of following it very closely, we discovered very quickly that we did not have the knowledge or the capabilities or the technology of even understanding the situation. But there were two people, two graduate students in MIT, who used a world model that had been prepared by their professor, Professor Foster, and they used that to try and develop a scenario of what was happening by using computer extrapolation, what would happen if the rest of the world lived like we lived. And of course it showed right away that we would simply overwhelm the resources of the planet and that it could not happen. And they produced this very dire and grim and negative scenario in which they basically said that we better stop progress, quote, unquote.
With limited resources, Malthus is right, and there's no...
Of course, we can only argue about the time, Jody. If you have an exploding population and you live on a finite planet, you can only argue about the time scale before you run out of resources. But this was 1972, and then we were talking in that book, in The Limits to Growth, as if the planet was a finite whole system in which man was forever encompassed and could never leave. We'd already left it 3 years before. We had stood on another planetary body 3 years before. And therefore, to me, personally, it came as a shattering shock that this had not been taken into account in the entire research carried out for that program. And I asked Aurelio Pecci, why not? I said, why haven't you taken this into account? And he said something that changed my life, and changed it radically, because he said, David, we have studied the universe and found it wanting. If you can prove to the contrary, go do it. And of course, I'm Irish, and somebody throws down a challenge like that. Naturally, I'm stupid enough to decide I'm going to do something about this, and or try. And so that led me from 1974 onwards into where I am today, having gone very heavily involved into the space area, because what I did was I tried to write a response to the limits to growth. And of course, I found out very quickly I didn't know enough, probably about everything, but I certainly didn't know enough about going out into space and how we could get the resources and what we could do and all of this. So I decided to try and study more about that, and having my beloved wife said, well, we're spending more money telephoning. I was living in Montreal in those days. We're spending more money telephoning down to Washington and with questions, why don't we just move down there and live there? It's going to be much easier. And so that is exactly what we did. And we came down here in 1977, the end of 77, and have been in the States ever since. And I spent the next 18 months at NASA and the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in studying and learning something about space. And as I did that, I got more and more and more and more involved. And involved into the fact that nobody on the Hill in Congress was asking questions, even talking about space, and yet we had just simply stood on the moon. 20 years ago, this year, we had stood on the moon, opened the doors to the universe, looked out and said, so what else is new? And turn around and come home. Remember the Chinese, Jody. We were guilty already of doing the same.